I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, the director, and I want to welcome you all to the ISSI colloquium, second in this semester. And before we begin, I want to remind all of you to turn off your cells, because it can be, in a small room like this, irritating. In a big room it can be irritating, but in a small room it can be more irritating. And then I wanted to draw your attention to an upcoming event that is co-sponsored by ISSI's Joseph Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues. The Honorable Abby Abinanti, who is Chief Judge of the Yurok Tribe and co-chair of the Judicial Council's Tribal Court State Court Forum, will give a talk entitled "Justice is Value-Based. Is it Time to Re-Examine the Values of the United States?" And her talk will be on Thursday, October 12th from 5 to 6:30 p.m. in the Warren Room at Bolt Hall. And is co-sponsored by, of course, Berkeley Law School. And Bolt Hall, for those of you who are new, is the Berkeley Law School. Now, as many of you know, that the procedure that we use is Professor Swidler will talk, our speaker will talk for about 45 minutes. And then after that is open for questions from all of you. I will stand up here and please raise your hand. I'll put you in the queue, and then Professor Swidler will just answer in the manner in which they have been recorded. Now it's a great deal. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Ann Swidler. For 30 years, she was professor of sociology here at UC Berkeley in the Department of Sociology, and she currently is professor of the graduate school here at the University of California at Berkeley. She's done enormous influential work on culture, religion, and American society, and her publications in journal form have been numerous. The classic, of course, that everybody knows, which she's probably sick of somebody like myself introducing her like this, is her article called Culture in Action. But in addition to all the journal articles, she's published a number of books. She's co-authored book Organization, titled Organization Without Authority and Talk of Love. She's co-authored Habits of the Heart, The Good Society, and Inequality by Design. Her interest in culture and institutions led her to study how societies in sub-Saharan Africa have responded to the AIDS epidemic, pan-epidemic, I should say, pandemic. And her newest book, which is a culmination of at least 10 years of research in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular Malawi, but in other areas as well, is co-authored with Susan Cox Watkins. Its title is A Fraught Embrace, the Romance and Reality of AIDS Altruism in Africa, and it was published by Princeton University Press in 2017. And at this moment, I would like to let all of you know that books will be for sale, and she will, of course, sign them in the room outside of here immediately after the formal presentation. I would say that our presentation today will include many of the findings in the books that will be for sale outside. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ann Swidler.
Thank you very much. It's a genuine pleasure to be here, and I see many friends and some very old friends, and a few people I actually don't know, so all good. I want to say first that I indulged myself by giving this talk the title that Susan and I had wanted for our book. So when you see the book physically, and I have a copy right here with me, you can just think of it as being called The Romance of AIDS Altruism in Africa, which Princeton thought was way too flip and not nearly somber and sad and difficult and tragic enough for the AIDS epidemic. So they gave us a cover that was somber, tragic, difficult, and unfun. And all I can say, I'd said this to my students many times when I taught a course on NGOs and the global AIDS epidemic, that it does absolutely no good for people suffering and dying to have no sense of humor. And if you study African societies, having no sense of humor is a catastrophic flaw. You cannot live there, work there, or be African without a good sense of humor. So you should just, the book has lots of things that you could say are irreverent. That would be a nice way to put it. And so be it. So I think Princeton does not have as good a sense of humor as one would want. Okay, and then I want to say it was very hard for me to prepare this talk, not because I was nervous, but because the last time I had given an equivalent version of it, which was a very nice sort of seminar thing in Norway, I literally talked for 3 hours. So cutting out enough slides, it was in a course. I mean, it wasn't that I went on 2 hours beyond the allotted time, but there were 3 hours allotted and I used all of them. So cutting out enough slides to get this talk into 45 minutes was excruciating. I hope I've succeeded in that, but it's made me want to tell you a little bit about what's in the book that isn't in the talk. And so just to say that in the book we have a whole chapter on the organized global AIDS enterprise and the organized development enterprise globally. So we have a very complex description of all the different kinds of actors and how both coordinated and uncoordinated they are as a system of global governance, and so on and so forth. We also have an extended chapter, and I'll get to a little bit of this, but a series of chapters on who the intermediaries are, who transmit and frequently block the grandiose plans of the global aid industry and shape whether those plans make it or in what form they make it on the ground. So a big focus of the book is on brokers, the intermediaries in the AIDS enterprise. We also have, we devote an enormous amount of time to establishing that our metaphor about a romance really works. So we have a chapter basically about how international donors fall in love with a local broker and how they become convinced that that person is the one. That's the person they can trust. That's the person they're going to work with. That's the person they believe in. And it might be someone they met on an airplane who they had a wonderful conversation with about their shared Christian belief. It might be the sister of the nanny of their acquaintance in London who happens to live in a village in Malawi who becomes their guide. It might be the pastor of a local church in Malawi. It might be a paid development worker. But this image of a romance is no joke, and it has all the aspects of a romance, which include initial infatuation, then sudden doubts, the terrified realization that this person isn't quite who you thought she or he was, the possibility of disillusionment and heartbreak, and then, and that's what I'm going to focus on mainly today, the possibility of reconciliation and at least the working possibility of an enduring relationship. So that's where I'm going. All right, and there are many other things that are in the book but not here. Okay, so that's the book. That would be all for your recording. On a set of sociological issues, which is why is studying responses to the AIDS, or why did I think studying responses to the AIDS epidemic in Africa gave me the possibility of studying some really fundamental sociological questions. And I would make, it's really two sides of the same argument. One is that when Western-style institutions get transplanted or implanted or forced upon societies that have a very different cultural terrain, what is usually the fused nature of cultural institutional systems, which is that you can't even use the term institution to describe something that is different from the culture that constitutes it and in which it is embedded. Once you move those forms to unfamiliar terrain, you can get a much better grip on what is carried in the structure of the institutions themselves, their formal rules, their constitutive principles, even their ideals, which do get transferred, and what remains part of the local context of practices, meanings, expectations, and so forth on the ground. And so for me, this was a way of getting at the culture and institutions relationship that I had been preoccupied with in Talk of Love. There's one way of getting at that. Habits of the Heart is very much about how American culture does or does not provide a basis for the kinds of institutions that Americans rely on. So this set of interest in culture and institutions is really different when you study institutions and cultures that aren't, that haven't grown up together, that haven't evolved together. And it also allows you a little bit to separate these analytic elements, which are the practices in the sense of very concrete kinds of local skills and knowledge that people have. Their conceptual elements, what it is they think the world is like, and then things we might call ideals, what people say. And I guess just to give you a preview of a couple of issues I'm going to talk about at the end, I would say that the ideals actually, in some respects at least, transfer fairly easily. That is, you can have modern European or American people saying things like everyone needs human rights or women are equal to men, and Africans on the ground saying these things with great conviction, and even occasionally local village people saying things that are totally compatible with what Western donors mean by these things. And I'll give you a tiny example just before I start. So one of these field diaries that Susan Watkins collected, which are one of the many sources of data we rely on, there's a woman and she's washing her clothes at the village borehole, so she's there with a bunch of other women. And her husband starts helping her. So she's washing clothes and he stands there with her. And the other women start laughing and teasing him and joking and saying, you know, what are you doing? Why are you here doing women's work? This is your wife supposed to be doing this. You're not supposed to be helping. What are you doing? And she says in Chiao, which is not even the dominant language of Malawi, it's the tribal language of this particular group, she says in Chiao, don't you know now we have, and then she uses the English word gender, she says. And so she has heard that this thing called gender exists. And because there's gender, it's totally fine for her husband to wash clothes, right? So that word and its associated meaning it's right there. Now, I'm not saying he wouldn't have washed clothes perfectly happily without the word gender, but she had that word to use. All right, so that is part of what has motivated and framed my deeper thinking about these issues. All right, now, the romance of development. This is really an outline of the talk, so I'm not going to talk about the details, but I want you to see the structure of where I'm going. So the larger theme is making relationships work, and that's making the relationship between international donors and individual altruists, both of whom we include under the broad heading altruism. These brokers who exist in multiple types. So we distinguish what we call cosmopolitan brokers, who are the ones you would run into an African or Asian woman who might show up at an international conference and she probably has a degree or at least speaks fluent English or French that would allow her to hobnob with you or anyone she met and might have a lot of connections and so forth. And she would be worth a lot in her home country because she perhaps can write a project report, can produce a strategy document, or can at least sit on the kind of committee that would produce that strategy document. They would probably outsource the actual writing to a 24-year-old American who couldn't find his rear end to wipe it. But that is just the way these things work. The second type we call the national elites, and those national elites are the kind of people who probably have a degree from the prestigious university, its chancellor college in the Malawi context, but there is one of these in every African country, very competitive to get in, a lot of solidarity among the graduates. And these people are people who, whatever else their interests and however nicely they can talk to donors, their top priority is maintaining their network ties within the local community. So they are the ones who will tell you that some project's going to work, it's going to be great, the budget is fine, the budget is great, And then it turns out, oops, the people to whom you gave the budget stole the money. Or there is a kind of surcharge. He might come back and say, oh, they want to know where is the vehicle you promised. And you say, there was no vehicle. And he says, oh yes. And the reason is, it's not that he's a lying skunk and you could never trust him. It's that it's much more important to him to be trusted by the other members of that national network. As one woman who was both a national elite and very much a local elite in Botswana said to me, she was being pressured to make AIDS much more of an emergency and do all sorts of things that sort of violated Swana rules and the government's practices and so forth. And she said, I have to leave. So that, if you just remember that, that will characterize these national elites. Then there are a whole bunch of these what we call district elites, but that's not really the right way to think of them. They are sometimes the local administrators hired by NGOs to run their field offices, so Save the Children or World Vision and so forth, and they might have only a high school degree or maybe a 2-year diploma after that, or maybe even a 4-year degree from some minor university or some private proprietary school, something like that. But they merge more or less successfully with the local elites, who might include the top-level tribal chiefs, so the group village headmen, the traditional authorities. These are relatively high-level authorities in rural Malawi, and in most African countries there are equivalent people. And the sort of town fathers, so maybe an important local pastor, an important local businessman, and they are the guardians of local moral order. So whatever it is that the big international NGOs think is important, what they think is important is kind of the moral and social integrity of their local communities. And since they're on top, they see all sorts of problems you don't see, like if churches have late night services where young people are out in the dark, that's what causes AIDS. You should shut down those church services, or you should get the prostitutes off the street, or you should shut down the local video parlor, because that's what's corrupting the youth and creating problems. And so you're talking the language of empowering women and human rights and so forth, and they're talking about shutting down the local video parlor. And then the last group we talk about are the interstitial or aspiring elites, and these are really the most fascinating group, and they are the ones who the romance is the most intense from their point of view, because they are typically educated enough to participate in many trainings and other activities that NGOs run, but they participate largely as volunteers. And they are volunteering with their total heart and soul because they so long to get out of the village and have any contact with Westerners, with new ideas. They're the ones who soak up words like gender, and we have these wonderful interviews where we say, well, what did you learn in your training? And this guy says, I learned that the penis has, the urethra goes through it, and semen and urine come from the same place. Susan, who's very sarcastic, said, wait, how old are you? He says, 24. And you didn't know this? And he says, well, I never saw it in a chart. I didn't know what the words were. I didn't know. And so you have people who just come out starry-eyed. The fallopian tube, ovary, what does the acronym human immunodeficiency virus, what does it stand for? And they become participants in a sort of global language, a global ideology, a global set of meanings that really elevate them above their fellow villagers in ways that are extremely important to them. And they have the distant hope of getting a job. So we look at the romance between donors, these brokers, and villagers. And I'll just say we have lots of evidence about villagers and these diaries that convey the views and experiences of villagers. But what I like best to describe this romance is an analogy with the biblical story of Jacob, who fell in love with Rachel, if you remember, and he worked for 7 years to earn the right to marry Rachel. His father-in-law basically insisted on this, and he took care of the guy's cattle and whatever. He worked his 7 years. And then he married her, and he went to go to bed with her, and he wakes up the next morning and finds out that he has been married off to her much less appealing older sister, Leah. So he finds and he has to work 7 more years to marry both sisters and finally have Rachel as a wife. And so they are the matriarchs of the Jewish people, so I'm very in favor of them. But you might say that the donors, the international altruists, have the same experience, which is what they long for is intimate communion with a real villager, a starving orphan, a dying AIDS patient, a simple villager in her little hut. And who they actually end up in bed with is a broker. So that's my favorite. Okay. Then what I'm going to move rapidly to are the sets of things around which donors, brokers, and villagers either come together or pulled apart. So I'm going to try to understand how, in the midst of these romantic fantasies and disappointments, these different groups manage to make things work. And so I'm going to look at 2 what I would call cooperative misunderstandings, which are Caring for Orphans and Fighting Stigma, both very popular among both villagers and donors, and 2 much less cooperative, 2 anxiety-provoking issues, which are empowering vulnerable women and fighting harmful cultural practices. Then I'm going to make a set of concluding remarks about why practices matter, and I'm going to discuss one important practice, which is training, and its relationship to the ideology of sustainability. Okay, now to plunge in. First, I want to say a little bit. This is just meant to impress you, which is we had tons of data. So the reason we wrote a book is that we thought, well, we wrote this article we really liked called Teach a Man to Fish, and then we said, oh my God, we have so much more material. Let's pursue these same ideas and write a book. And then we got to the end of the book and we said, oh my God, we have so much material we couldn't include. So there are literally thousands of interviews done over well over a decade. There are qualitative interviews, so the huge survey, qualitative interviews, interviews with donors and brokers, and then these remarkable ethnographic journals that Watkins collected, which are anonymized and available online at the University of Michigan. So if you look up Malawi journals, first of all, you could have Susan on, what's it called, the This American Life. They did a segment on gossip, and they spent 20 minutes or more on the Malawi journals. And then the journals themselves, which are just a remarkable data source, are available free to anyone who wants them. And then we spent a lot of time, we read a lot of newspapers, reports, and gray literature, and then we did a lot of what I call motel ethnography, which is hanging out in motels, and that's where we got all our best ideas, okay, in these motels in rural Malawi. So, all right. Then I've gone through your donors, brokers, villagers, and I'm not going to say more about them, since that's where I started. This is just a little visual to give you a sense. Outside any Malawian town, there would be 60 or 70 things like this. So this is just one photograph actually taken by Don Tryman, if you want to know, when he came to visit us. But you could, in this town, which was Balaka in southern Malawi, there would be many of these, and if you came to the town from different angles, you would run into more and more of them. You see World Vision and USAID and PCI Malawi and GOAL, which is an Irish charity, and then this all sort of fused with religious things. The Emmanuel International is kind of a religious charity and provides, bicycles. And then this is an NGO of a different sort. This says Makanda Churches, HIV, AIDS, Aged Youth, and Orphans Care, and it actually has enough income from somewhere to have a little office there. You can see the word office above the door. But it is clearly a very different kind of enterprise than those things at the gates to the city, so to speak. And then here, you have what I would call an aspirational NGO. So there's a couple of boys, and they've got something called Tianjani Youth Club, and they may be hoping that a donor or altruist would discover them and give them a little bit of resources via their youth club. So, yeah. Okay, now what are the, we distinguish themes and practices, but here are the themes. And I want to say a little bit about fighting stigma, just because it is so fascinating. So all of you who study anything to do with HIV and AIDS or who've heard anything about it know that one of the major issues that was important is fighting the stigma. Well, when I first got to Malawi, I was there first time in 2004, and we went to a research dissemination conference, and I was looking around. There were, I don't know, 200 or 300 people, mostly Malawians, who did some kind of research and were giving papers in their conference rooms everywhere, and sort of like sociology meetings, but a little smaller. And there were tables out in the hallway, and there was a big table of the Adventists. And the Adventists run hospitals all over Africa, so they have major investment in African health. And I was looking at their literature, which was a bunch of very nice brochures with beautiful colored photographs on the covers and so forth. And I'm starting to say, I wonder what the Adventists are doing. And I start collecting these things. And then I realized they're all about fighting stigma. And I thought, gosh, what about condoms? What about not having multiple sexual partners? What about, I was already interested in male circumcision for HIV prevention. Nowhere. Fighting stigma. And then I realized, churches love fighting stigma because it has to do with their basic mission, which is telling people they should love and care for one another, that God, in the end, accepts everyone. And they don't have to talk about really uncomfortable things like sex or condoms, or indeed the fact that their own pastors are probably, because they're important people in the community, having sex with multiple members of their own congregations. And all of that can be left, by the way, if they are fighting stigma. And international donors love it because that was what was so important for the gay community in the West, where much of the AIDS response that got imported around the world was developed. And in the West, it was incredibly important. I do not believe that the conquering of HIV, which largely happened before the drugs were available, could have happened without the tremendous moral self-assertion of the gay community, who saw fighting for dignity and self-respect as being the same thing as conscientiously using a condom every time you had sex. That was a form of political action that they embraced as part of an entire agenda of sort of moral self-assertion. But the stigma part was really exported as if it were the key. That was the thing that had worked. And there's I'll just say zero evidence of any such thing. It's not. So fighting stigma appeals a lot to donors. It also appeals, it turns out, to locals. Because villagers also share very strongly the notion that you should care for those who are ill. Village chiefs are very worried about local village harmony, as are pastors and sheikhs who have their own issues in their own congregations. And Jenny Trinitopoli and Alex Weinreb have done major work on this, where they've actually shown that these pastors tell people you cannot divorce a spouse who is ill with AIDS. And their answer, their reason, very simple. Who would take care of her? Who would take care of him? Of course you can't divorce the person. Of course you can't abandon the person. Of course you have to care for the person. So telling Africans to, not stigmatize people, telling them to love each other, this is what they tell each other all the time. So, in fact, this is a sidebar, but it's cute. So one of the things that showed up at some point in the community-based organization, sort of the routine you had to go through if you were a village organization that wanted to get a little bit of funding from the National AIDS Commission in Malawi, there came to be a standardized format in which you had to apply for the money. So these were handwritten documents, of which we have hundreds scanned, but they were all done in exactly the same format. And so one of the things that ended up migrating into those documents is, what are the benefits of this project and what are the risks? So it migrated directly from the IRB world, the idea that you had to specify the risks of your little community-based organization. But these villagers dutifully, they had to describe the risks. So some of them said things like, the risk is the chief could steal all the money. But some of them said the risk is people won't love each other. That's what they conceived of as a risk. So I would just say that the adjuration to love each other is perfectly compatible, so everybody's happy with Stigma. Wonderful. And Orphans and Vulnerable Children has, so here's what I just said. It works beautifully, and donors like fighting stigma because churches do it, and NGOs imagine they're fighting discrimination, whereas the villagers imagine that they are telling each other to love each other and care for each other. But this is perfectly compatible. And they oppose stigma for the reasons I just said. They need to love each other, and they don't want conflict and jealousy. They want village harmony. Okay, orphans are also beloved of both donors and villagers. And they are beloved of donors because that is what opens pocketbooks like nothing else. So if you are going to help orphans, you have an automatic ticket. And this is everything from individual altruists drawn to places like Malawi, who the thing they all want to do is work with orphans, work in an orphanage, and so forth. And there are actually very few orphanages in Africa. Most African orphans are taken up by their extended families, and so they almost never end up with no one to care for them. In fact, the systematic data shows that while there are definitely problems in your emotional health if you're orphaned, you tend to have better opportunities because the relatives who take you in are much more likely to be the wealthier relatives who live in a city who have access to better schooling. So you're orphaned in your tiny rural village somewhere where there is no secondary school, for example, and maybe not even a school beyond 6th grade, and you're taken in by your city relative for whom you might end up doing all the dishwashing and a lot of other household chores, but you will nonetheless get to go to school and probably eat better than you would have in your little subsistence agricultural village. So, but donors and all sorts of altruists love orphans. And again, if you can describe how you've changed the lives of orphans, how you've improved their situations, how you've taught them skills, how you've paid for them to go to school, everybody's happy. And again, if you can actually give people real orphans to embrace, to feed, and so on and so forth. It turns out, however, that orphans are puzzling to Africans. And I use that word because as I only know this for a few countries, but in South African languages, in Malawi's, the Bantu languages at least, there is no word for orphan. That is, there is no word for that distinguishes a child who has lost his or her parents. There is a word that gets used, that gets translated as orphan, which means abandoned and neglected. And so most African people, at least initially, did not like to use that word because it implied that the community and the family had failed that person. So using the word that means abandoned and neglected means that you yourselves, since the obligation would be on the whole community, on the relatives, not to abandon and neglect that person, to use a word that means orphan in and of itself made people extremely uncomfortable. And there was a real issue, which I'm going to go to the next slide and then go back, but chiefs in particular, but all sorts of local people, including sometimes the mid-level brokers, had a lot of trouble with the idea that you were going to provide funding for children who happen to have lost their parents versus other children who might not be orphans. So again, imagine a village where a few of the children have lost their parents and been taken in by a local relative. And so those children would get blankets or shoes from World Vision, or maybe even they usually don't get it, but the $35 a month that you're sending to some child support organization. So if you're giving money to save the children, whatever. And then other equally poor children in that family or in that cluster of huts, all of them starving during the hunger season, all of them with the same empty bellies, all of them with the same difficulty in paying school fees. And those orphans get money and the others don't. So the chiefs are very upset by this. Envy is a huge problem for village harmony. A great deal rests on informal patterns of cooperation. And so envy and resentment are very, very dangerous. They lead to witchcraft, which is extraordinarily dangerous and terribly frightening. And so everyone is interested in preventing causes of envy. That sort of damping down the possibility that this will erupt in some form. So chiefs were very, very uncomfortable about orphans. That was really a problem for them. Okay, now I have to go back. Sorry, I don't have this in perfect order. But one thing that was extremely helpful was a set of UN reports. And what those UN reports did, they depended on smart demographers who managed to get a better technical definition of orphan. And they did this by being able to count not only maternal orphans, that is a child whose mother had died, but paternal orphans. And they developed some estimator for how you could know how many children had lost either parent. And they used that to develop a new definition of orphan, in which an orphan was not what we think of, which is a child who's lost both parents, but a child who had lost either parent. And that blew up the numbers into an astronomical number overnight. So like in Malawi, I think 3% of children have lost both parents, and something like 13% have lost a parent. So this really meant that these global organizations could say there was an orphan crisis that had erupted. They could estimate 23 million orphans in 23 developing countries and projected 35 million by 2000 and 40 million by 2010. And that could unlock vast amount of resources for orphans. At the same time, you have this set of problems, and the solution is to develop this wonderful new category, which is orphans and vulnerable children, or as it's sometimes called, orphans and other vulnerable children. And once you have that, then you can distribute. World Vision does this. They do not give your $35 to your orphan, nor should they. They do village-level projects that are supposed to create sustainable agriculture, whatever, that should benefit all the children in the village. So you get this kind of sleight of hand that allows you to keep global donors donating and not offend the sensibilities of local people, and find a kind of compromise on the ground that allows the money to be used for anyone defined as vulnerable, who might turn out, by the way, to be the chief's relatives, but that's another. Okay. Now, I want to move quickly to a set of much more difficult issues. I might get through only the first one. But I'll say that vulnerable women and harmful cultural practices could not be resolved nearly as easily. And why is that? Well, donors see vulnerable women and see them as central to the AIDS epidemic. These are the women who are so poor that they have to have survival sex with men who have money. And if you empower them and you make them more independent and they have some kind of a trade or profession, they can support themselves or some source of income, or if you teach them the skills they need to do good sexual bargaining, you'll protect them. Whereas what the locals see, and this is true of the brokers at all levels, as well as of local villagers, they also agree that poor women or women who need money are at the heart of the AIDS epidemic. But what they see is mercenary women who, because they want more, because they need money, they threaten men, they are a danger to society, they are breaking up the marriages of respectable women, and they are endangering respectable men. And this is why it sometimes seems that donors and brokers are talking about the same thing, and then when they try to actually come together around programs, it turns out they cannot talk to each other because they are on fundamentally different pages. And here I'm going to indulge myself with just a little of so here's vulnerable women need to be empowered, and that's the last thing Malawians think that poor women need. So I'm going to quickly read a little bit of this. I'm watching my time, but I'm going to enjoy myself. This is from one of the diaries that Susan collected, these wonderful, they're sometimes called conversational journals. And this is a person observing a public fight when an outraged wife attacked her husband's girlfriend. And the total excerpt is much longer than this, but we squeezed it down. So the diarist wrote, "A certain businessman is married and has got 4 children, but he has also a sexual partner who is well known for having sex with married men. Today, the man went to chat with the girlfriend who has spent the night with him at Isha Allah Rest House. He thought that nobody had seen him because he used a certain path which is behind the market. The friend of his wife, who was going to the market, saw the man entering the rest house, and she rushed to her friend and tell her the whole story that her husband has entered the rest house." And then we summarize, when the wife and her friend see the couple coming out of the rest house, holding hands, talking lovely, laughing and kissing, they start after the girlfriend, whereupon the husband skedaddles. He gets out of there. Many people rushed to the scene of the incident and supported the 2 women. The 2 women, that is the wife and her friend, beat the girl seriously and tore her clothes. The girl cried with pain, for she had several wounds on the face, and she managed to cut the finger of the wife, of her boyfriend, leaving it about to fall down, and the wife cried with pain. Then she touches the breast of the girlfriend and cut it with her mouth, and she basically bit her. So this public fight is about how an outraged wife responds to a woman who is infringing on her property rights in her husband, on her claims on her husband, who is causing her painful sexual jealousy, and she responds by attacking this woman. And there are many incidents like this in the diary where women beat up other women, and they beat them up over just these sorts of incidents. The same thing happens at the elite level. So a cabinet minister, and this woman she just got removed from the cabinet this year, but she was in the cabinet for at least 20 years. She had every job you could imagine: Minister of Youth, Gender, and blah, blah, Minister of AIDS, blah, blah, and blah, blah. She was the government spokesperson in the current regime until something like June, when she didn't take her hat off out of respect for some other minister. I mean, who knows what went on behind the scenes. But I'm reading from 2 different newspaper articles. So at a girls' empowerment workshop, her name is Patricia Cagliati. Cagliati said her ministry will ensure the girl child is protected and empowered, starting in homes in the community. Cagliati, a former teacher, also received overwhelming applause and chanting during an inspirational talk, bluntly telling schoolgirls to finish school and avoid the evils of early marriage. In another context, however, she speaks as a wife seeking to protect her marriage. In 2007, the Saturday Nation reported that Cagliati had kidnapped and beaten a maid, Elizabeth Nagwala, who she believed had sex with her husband. This actually happened more than once. Apparently, Cagliati's husband is strays. Nagwala, 33, who once worked, I love this, for Blantyre-based women's rights lawyer Siori White, claims the group took her to Nkondo, the minister's home, where Cagliati allegedly struck the victim, and the minister asked the men to lay with her, that is, to rape her, as punishment for going out with Mr. Cagliati. When contacted for her side of the story late last month, the minister said Nagwala could not have been harassed without having done any wrong. Said Cagliati, "Wasn't she caught with my husband? Go and ask her if she wasn't found with him. She must face me, and we must find out all about this." So she didn't deny it. She didn't say she hadn't had this woman kidnapped and raped. She said, if this woman wants to come have sex with my husband, that's what she deserves and that's what she'll get. So if you want to understand why the global human rights and women's empowerment language might not work and might not actually produce a meeting of minds in Malawi, you have to understand how this is thought about and experienced at the local level, and it's not the way you think about it. And then I'm going to say just one word, so I don't have time, and I didn't put the slides in, about harmful cultural practices. But this is an issue. It's in the book. It works very nicely because in this case, it is the elite brokers who want to work on harmful cultural practices. practices. And they are convinced that backward, superstitious, ignorant villagers are doing all these terrible, harmful things. They're having dry sex, they're having initiation rituals, they're forcing women whose husbands have just died of AIDS to have sex with a sexual cleanser to get over whatever pollution is involved in being widowed. They're having women who had miscarriages sleep with the sexual cleanser, and that these kind of dirty, backward, frightening village practices are what drives the AIDS epidemic. Now, it happens that these things sound really terrible, but that there's no evidence at all that they actually have driven the AIDS epidemic, and the few systematic studies show zero effect. So, but they keep saying, well, this is what we know about. You don't understand my country, but this is my expertise. This is what I have to contribute to fighting HIV. I'm the one, and these are educated people who look down on and have a tremendous sense of distance from these backward villagers. The global authorities periodically fund a study of such things to keep the local brokers happy, but they wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. Why? Because going in and trying to change backward African practices? Are you kidding me? They are so worried about cultural insensitivity and cultural sensitivity and so forth, they don't want to go anywhere near it. So that's another case where sort of anxiety surrounds this issue on both sides, and there's no meeting of minds. All right, what do they end up doing? And I have to stick to my time, so I'm going to skip a little bit here. But they end up converging on basically a major practice that allows them to work together even when they don't agree. And that is the practice of having constant, never-ending training. And training is really the thing that works for everyone. So I recommend that if there is some wonderful project you're interested in that is about environment or about development or about empowering women or about preventing HIV or about protecting gay rights, read down into the fine print and find out what they actually do. And I guarantee you that the gigantic component of this is likely to be training, 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 and more training. Why? Because it is cheap. Because training is supposed to give knowledge and information that transform the person who's trained, the donor can walk away with no guilt. That is, you completed your mission, and you're free to go on to the next village, the next project, the next country, the next theme. And the brokers like it because those are the jobs they get, being trainers of trainers, and then it's a kind of easy job that you can do without terribly much technical skill. So you can work your way up from a volunteer to a trained volunteer to a trainer of trainers. So it provides a kind of career path. And here I'm just going to give just a little bit. It's pervasive. This is an example of one of these community-based organizations, and this is their application for OVC, that's Orphans and Vulnerable Children Training, and they want allowances for the participants. They get a little bit of per diems, refreshments, stationery. They eventually hire a hall, and this is their home-based care training. Oops, looks identical. And this is their training for child protection. And there actually are 9 different kinds that constitute the bulk of their application for training. Okay, now the moral political argument here, and I haven't built up to this very well, but I want you to know what it is that there is an element of altruism which is profoundly narcissistic. And that is that what we want to do for other people is to project onto them, to teach them the things that matter most to us. So this is particularly true for people like me who consider themselves feminists, for whom the women's movement, or can be for people for whom the gay rights movement or human rights have been the transformative experience of their lives, the empowerment that we thought, at least, that the New Left brought. And therefore, that is the thing. We are just like the missionaries. If Jesus saved me, I've got to bring Jesus to you. And it is exactly the same logic, which is this transformed me, and therefore that's what you need, and I don't care what you think you need. I know what you need. The other is a sort of sociological lesson, and there are a whole bunch of these, but I would say a highlight is I really have become more convinced than I was before I started this research that the thing sociologists forget to pay enough attention to is the power of moral imagination and identity in driving people's practices in social life. I do not think we are mainly material creatures who live on our incomes, and I think one reason we fail to so completely to deal effectively with the current moment in American society is that we do not take moral imagination and the sense of identity it's connected to seriously enough. The second, and I'm just going to say this very, very briefly, but when institutional cultural orders intersect, you can try to think about what wins out and why. And here I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I don't know what will win out 40 years or 60 years or 100 years from now if the planet survives. But in the short term, people have been working at community-driven development, participatory governance, empowering women, human rights for a couple of decades now. And I would say what actually happens on the ground is that local practices colonize global organizational forms. So the local practices are patron-client ties, and you come in thinking you are running a human rights organization, participatory governance, and they're totally fine with it, they're welcoming, warm, and so forth, and they have enrolled you, I would use that term, they have enrolled you as what they experience you as, which is a patron. And if you're a good patron, your project will go well. If you're a bad patron and you don't understand how patrons should behave, your project will go badly. But it doesn't matter what you think you are. You are, in fact, a patron. And so I won't try to answer this question, but I'll just say what that leaves us with sociologically is a question about the relationship between practices as concrete enactments of skilled ways of being in the world and articulated social ideals, which also matter greatly. And figuring out how these things articulate in moments of global transformation or moments of local transformation, and why they also constitute forms of stability and persistence. I'm 2 minutes over. But
It's okay. Okay, and remember to raise your hand, keep your hand raised, and I'll just nod if I have it. So we'll open for the first questions. I guess you were so good, there's no questions.
now.
And that was great. What you said at the end is kind of interesting to me because a common critique of development work is that it's neo-colonial. And what I hear you saying at the end is that it's the local practices or the local understandings that really take over. And so that suggests it's not that neo-colonial after all, although still there is this, differential material power. So anyway, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Partly, I would say, this doesn't come so directly out of my work, but there's a really smart guy named Marion Burchart, and he has a wonderful paper on faith-based organizations in South Africa, where he actually critiques some of my earlier papers on this. I have a paper called The Dialectics of Patronage, which I think is a really good paper. But anyway, he discusses those ideas, and he says, look, Swidler underestimates, and I'm going to get to an answer to your question, but he says basically Swidler underestimates how rapidly new institutional practices congeal. So there are local expectations, but they are not just the unchanging mores of the village or something like that. And they are also not what the global actors think they are. They are things that congeal right around whatever the practices, the concrete practices of these international NGOs are. Yes, like training. But he uses the example, and I actually have this in that paper, but I didn't see the significance of it. That my example is I interviewed a whole bunch of people, but one of them was a Peace Corps worker who had worked in Cote d'Ivoire. And she described a situation in which she came to school and she had the kids paint a map of Africa and then a map of Cote d'Ivoire on the wall of the school building, and she provided all the paints and this and that. And at the end, she gave every child a ruler and a pencil or something like that. And they said, "What do you mean a ruler and a pencil?" And they threw them at her and said, "We don't want this. You said it was a project, not a community enhancement activity." If we knew it was community enhancement and activity, fine, but project, you're supposed to pay us. So there was language embedded in the development enterprise around which expectations, sort of normative order, had congealed, and they had a distinct, I might not have the terms exactly right, but they had, expectations had congealed around these things. But I would still argue that in the large picture, you're right, and I guess I would put it differently, which is the aspiration is certainly a neo-colonial one, which is to ignore the way people actually live, the way they actually get their business done, the things in their own societies upon which they depend in their current circumstances, without which they cannot survive, like the authority of their male chiefs and so forth, and to imagine that you can come in and say, wait a minute, this isn't democratic. Why aren't half your chiefs women? Why aren't you run by an elected committee? As if that would solve anything. And that is highly neo-colonial, but the good news is it doesn't work. So these things collapse the minute the donors go away.
Just a minute. Yes. No, you.
I wanted to ask exactly the same question, so it's all.
Okay. Rana?
I can give a couple more answers, actually. I have more to say about it, but.
And
Okay.
I really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to ask about the mercenary versus vulnerable women. And your examples didn't talk about the risks and the dangers of AIDS transmission. You were talking more about sexual jealousy and...
Oh, but they see that as, those are the risks of AIDS transmission.
So talk about that more.
Well, I mean, the way they see it is that these women who sleep with other women's husbands give them AIDS, and then they bring it into their families. Nothing could be more threatening than that. So the more you emphasize the dangers of HIV, the more you convince people that, so even, I mean, again, when we first got to Malawi that first time, and we were interviewing a very nice guy who worked for Save the Children. At that time I was just interviewing broker types. And he said, oh yes, these bar girls, terrible, that's a big source of HIV. The bar girls are sort of, they're not exactly prostitutes, but anyway, work in bars and occasionally sleep with customers. But they don't, that's not their full-time job. Their full-time job is waiting tables, and they usually take one client a night, maybe. So he said, oh yeah, these bar girls, terrible, that's where. So we've forbidden women to enter the bars. And that's going to solve, that's no women in bars. So that's going to be the solution. Mr. Cagliati actually, when he got caught before having sex with somebody, said, oh, I'm never going to hire any women again. There's going to be no problem. I'm not going to be accused of this anymore. So you're asking about HIV risk, but the way they see it, it is these sex workers, prostitutes, loose women, women who have sex with more than one person. They're the ones who are transmitting HIV. Now, they do have another narrative, which is about sugar dads. And sugar dads are wealthy men who have sex with young women, but they still they blame the sugar dads, and these are figures of ridicule, let's say, just very term, but they also blame the, quote, schoolgirls for tempting men. So I think you also have to see, and this is a plus and minus, and again, generalizing about Africa is really terrible. But I'll say...
The follow-up question
Yeah,
would be, then you take AIDS out of the equation.
No, but AIDS is in the equation.
But pre-AIDS, let's put, this was still happening to some degree. These
Multiple
blaming
partners?
of loose women on sexual jealousy grounds,
Yes.
and that kind of thing.
Sure. Although, in many, I won't say all African societies, and there's a famous paper about this by Caldwell and Quiggin, who are a demographer couple, and then I don't know who Quiggin is, called something like African Patterns and the Era of HIV/AIDS. And the argument is that in African societies there was always way too much land and not enough people. So most African practices involve trying to draw people to rather than rule over them in specified territories. So chiefs they're more interested with holding their people to them than with bossing them around. And that's because people could always walk away. Well, they're also interested in growing more people. That's just an incredibly valuable thing. And so female fecundity is so value. That it's really, the term loose woman wouldn't normally be used even of a woman who had more than one partner, who got pregnant without being married. Very common in places like Botswana to basically see if someone's fertile and then decide over a long period of time to arrange a marriage. So Christianity, of course, changed and started to give a different valence to these practices. So I would say that yes, there is sexual jealousy, and probably there always was, but these patterns in which women themselves develop patron-client ties using sexuality as a way to tie multiple people to them and to have some security if their own husbands died or if they were suddenly needy, those are very long-standing. So it's not a perfect answer to your question, and partly I don't know what went on exactly in the past. But
I actually am going to take some indecent liberty and just say, in my study of indigenous people, the idea of multiple sexual partners and being morally suspect for it just falls out. You could actually be jealous as a person, but you'd have no community support for the jealousy. So in other words, you might have felt somebody betrayed you, but without that community support for it, which I think she's talking about, it actually, the kinds of things that you get in the Christian world fall out, basically.
well, the stuff you get in a world where land was always in short supply, so knowing who was going to inherit your land and whether your children, from man's point of view, were really your biological children, became critical. And so you locked women up and created honor and shame cultures. And African societies, most of them, just never did that. So,
Larry.
In one word, wow. This is very impressive.
thank you.
Thank you. And and you went through all these categories of people like donors and so forth, and everyone was evocative to me. The donors, one imagines the television commercials. And I love the concept of they're looking for intimacy and the narcissism and all of that. But there was one of these categories that you didn't. Well, I would like you to elaborate a little bit. It's the interstitial elites.
Yeah, they're my faves.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. And I wonder in particular, and I don't want to hold you to this, but in particular when you end with this notion of kind of reverse colonialism, that the locals colonize the donors and the foreign elites. Here are the people who are trying to get out of there. Yeah. How do they fit into that kind of notion of reverse colonialism?
What's going through my head, and then I'll answer your question, is the number of metaphors we tried to generate to describe this group. Because these are the groups who, for one metaphor, have sort of 1 foot in the village and 1 foot out of the village. For a very different metaphor, they are the group who imbibe the rhetoric and the lessons of the global system the most completely. They are sold. And the anecdote, which is in this paper on Teach Man to Fish, and we used it again in the book, but it was the part of motel ethnography that just totally did it for us. And then I am going to answer your question about the neo-colonial aspects. But we met these guys who had just been in a training, and they told us a whole long story about how they had developed an AIDS youth group, and they had gone to World Vision for funding, and they put their request for, World Vision was administering these community-based organization proposals. They had a grant to do it, so they put their proposal for a youth group in with World Vision, and they didn't hear anything for months. And when they finally went back to the World Vision office to see how their little proposal had fared, and this is Malawi in English, they shouted us, and they drove them away. Basically said, I'm not going to give you money. And we said, well, were you angry? Were you angry when? And they said, no, World Vision is a glittering castle. They meant a mirage. That's how they were. And that's what led us to form our youth group. So we're grateful. We weren't angry, we were grateful. Because what we got from this was this ability to have a youth group and so forth. So you're right, they drink the Kool-Aid, to use yet a different metaphor. on the other hand, what the donors imagine is happening, and this is the thing I want to say that training so wonderful, you gave me the excuse to say it, is that you're going to train these people who, remember, these are educated relative to their village, they are educated elites, but they can't get out of the village because there is almost no formal employment in most African countries, actually. And so they're stuck for at least some number of years with their good education and their ability to show up at a training in a neatly ironed shirt and skirt, or neatly ironed shirt and set of slacks, with beige, which is an incredibly important status marker, and so forth. But they, most of the time, have to do the same kind of back-breaking agricultural labor that everyone else in the village is doing. So the idea is you're going to train these people, and then they are going to go back to the village and train their fellow villagers to create early childhood education. That's another thing you can train people for. Or to create microfinance, or to create new agricultural practices, or to reduce malaria exposure, or to prevent HIV, or to do home-based care, and they will show up for as many of these trainings as you'll do because they get a little per diem and they get this authorized knowledge that they really want. But in no way are they going to go back to the village and train their fellow villagers. They want out of the village. They want a job in your organization so they don't have to stay in the village. And so the whole model of development in which these people are going to transmit these Western forms of organization, no, they're not. They're going to try to get a job in the NGO for which they volunteer sometimes for years, or they try different NGOs and try to look for one that might eventually get them employment and get them out of the village. That's what they're focused on. And then they experience that as a patron-client system. And so the rhetoric, that's why I think these are ideas I haven't completely worked out, but the practices remain very much patron-clientized because that's how you get and keep jobs. And the rhetoric is this global rhetoric that legitimates you as a member of a global order that's very prestigious and very important. So,
thank you for a very insightful talk. I was struck by the framing, romance, metaphor for it. So I was wondering, would you use other genres, tragedy and comedy, or other fields of development?
That's nice.
Or is it peculiar, this coupling between, unintended, coupling.
Yeah,
this connection between romance and AIDS.
No, I would use it for the entire development enterprise. And again, it's not that it's a romance of AIDS. It's the romance is a romance between donors, brokers, and villagers, and it's the romance of believing that you're going to connect with an other who's very different from you but needs you and who will reciprocate your generosity and your vision and so forth with love and attachment. And so once I don't know if you've been to Africa or you've worked there, but if you have, I guarantee that you will get deeply emotionally attached to someone you meet probably on your first trip. And that will probably be a lifelong attachment. If it works out, you will adore that person, you will feel connected to that person, you will want to help that person. And it's partly because enrolling other people to assist you is one of the main ways people survive in these patron-client systems. That is what they do. That's what they're good at. And they mean it. So this is really hard for people to understand. But if you get to know somebody, and then sometimes people you hardly know will come up and you'll realize, oops, I thought I was interviewing this person or talking to him, and suddenly I'm hearing the sad story about his wife is ill and needs medicine and his children need school fees, and oops, I know what's coming, and then it'll be, could you assist me? And you're kind of irritated and you're thinking, I don't want this. And you say, no, I'm sorry, I can't help you, or whatever. And they might say, well, can I have your email? And then they'll write to you multiple times and see if you can assist them. And you just say, no. But it sometimes happens that somebody you think you really have a friendship with, you end up assisting. And we tend to feel betrayed. We tend to feel, wait, I thought that person loved me for myself, and now She wants money from me or material help. And all I can say, and I'll say it with absolute conviction, is that we have a kind of Western fantasy that material assistance and genuine affection and love are polar opposites. And so if you really love somebody, you wouldn't ask for money from them, and if you ask for money from them, it means you didn't really love them. And in African societies, these two things are the same thing. So in our diaries, some guy is being asked by his friends why he doesn't break up with a girlfriend who's given him gonorrhea. And he hasn't slept with anybody but her in a year, and so he knows that she's the one who must have been having other partners. His friends are saying, look, there's AIDS around, don't stick with this woman. And he says, but I have to stay with her. He says, I love her. I love her, and I gave her a blue jean skirt and a certain kind of hat, and he starts enumerating the gifts he gave her. And so he's saying, I can't break up with her. I love her. I gave her this, and I gave her that, and I gave her the other thing. And so I can't and so he's literally saying that giving her these material things and loving her are the same thing. So back to your question about who the romance is with. I would argue that any development project that works in a very poor country involves the same romantic fantasy. So if you work, you go do organic gardening in Guatemala with your church group or something, you still have the same fantasy, which is a little brown child is going to, come up and hug your legs and dance. And at least in the African, I've never been to a Guatemalan village, but in the African villages, they will come out and dance in gratitude. And we've read a lot of the blogs of people, church groups and other groups who've gone to Africa. And that's what they write about. They say, we had the most incredible evening, The children came and they were so happy and they danced for us and they told us how grateful they were for the help we've given them. I mean, I would argue the romance has nothing to do with the fact that AIDS is sexually transmitted or HIV is sexually transmitted, not AIDS. It has to do with the way altruism is motivated, not completely, but by people's, fantasy lives. I mean, everything in life is motivated by our fantasy lives. So let me just say, there's nothing wrong with fantasy, right? Without it,
one way or another, you can get there. Right?
Absolutely. So I mean, I don't want to say anything too personal, but I'll just suggest, if you're not capable of having fantasy, you probably don't have much fun.
Okay, I have a fantasy that we're going to get all these questions in, and so I'm going to take 3 in a row, and then so just ask your question, and she'll get to maybe where she can answer each one first.
Sure.
And let's take these.
Thanks, that was really good. I really liked your take on this sort of like the institutional narcissism of NGOs, and it reminded me a lot of my own experience doing research in South Africa, where when I used to study a group that organized these mass land occupations, land seizures, and about 2 years after the group's formation, they started getting funding from War on Want in Britain. And pretty quickly shifted to a training-only group, where actually the primary activity is called Train the Trainer. And since having participated in a single land occupation, and so as soon as the money came in, it became a kind of engine itself. And so it got me thinking, since that's such a different field than, say...
Wow. Have you written that up?
Sort of. But yeah, I need to write it up in that way now. Yeah. So I should say, when I was just there over the summer, and we watched this group dialogue with a funder over Skype, but sort of I was hidden out of view, and the funder didn't know I was there. They really tried to push them to sort of organize more trainings, as opposed to get back to the initial point of the group. But all this is to say, it's a very different field, say land occupations, than something like AIDS.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you think this is something endemic to the very institutional form of NGOs, or whether there's a kind of iron law of oligarchy at work, or if there's a way out. Or
yeah, I mean...
you can't answer it.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
You got to get next question.
My question is about the generalization of Africa, and what ways specific places matter to your project, and what the conceptual work of the idea of Africa is doing in altruism.
And you're last.
Thank you. Similar question. Can you say more about the theoretical conclusions you draw about the dialectic maybe culture and institutions. You spell out some of the points, but I'm sure you have
Yeah.
more.
I have
bigger
lots
things.
more, but a lot more incoherent, so I don't know if I'll get to that one.
Okay.
So, wait, I'll answer the second one. I can't remember the first one. What was the question?
So just about the NGO, whether you think there's an NGO forum
Oh,
higher
yeah.
level.
Okay. Let me first say that when it comes to other aspects of the AIDS enterprise, just to take that, namely the provision of antiretroviral drugs, the global organizations have done a fantastic job. And they've done it partly by doing it all themselves. So they control the supply chains. They don't let actual Africans, or at least not in Malawi, probably in Botswana they do, but in Malawi, where there's a lot of corruption, they don't let Africans anywhere near the actual supply chain. They bring this stuff in, they put it in warehouses, they put it in trucks, they ship it to local. But they have, throughout Africa, prolonged or saved millions and millions and millions of lives. So the idea that the global aid enterprise can't do anything is just not true. And sometimes they work through things that could be called NGOs. I mean, Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, or there's something called Lighthouse in Malawi that's supported by MSF Luxembourg. And so lots of things you could call NGOs actually function very well there. And so, yes, I think one sort of slight dishonesty in our book or something is that we look only at AIDS prevention activities. And if you think about it, what else could you do for HIV prevention than try to teach people things? Now, since the systematic data shows that 96% of Malawians knew as early as something like 1988 that HIV was sexually transmitted and that you got it by having multiple partners and not using a condom, it's not clear what more training people needed. And so usually the training is about things that are totally irrelevant, like fallopian tubes and ovaries and stuff, which you don't have to know about, and which knowing about does nothing to keep you from having dangerous sexual activities. So, but yes, I think pretty much the NGO enterprise is, let me put it this way, most NGOs lack technical skills. They have an aspiration to do lots of kinds of good, but they don't have any, and if you think about the people who volunteer on the Western side, most of them are not skilled at anything. They may get some skills when they get to Malawi. They can do things. I know a guy who got to practice architecture, even though he isn't trained as an architect, a woman who started a nice business to employ local seamstresses, even though her history was as a school teacher. I mean, the Western donor types get to do some new things when they found a little local NGO. But basically, what are they going to do? That they can't provide real material help. They don't want to provide it long term. So I would say it's built into the way NGOs think about their activities. And this is going on longer than you want, I know.
I got two questions to go in. That's all.
Huh?
There's two more you got to get to.
I'm going to get to.
Okay.
But I want to say this, which is if you try to imagine a situation in which a nice foundation, Gates or something, employs somebody to come in and be a new program officer, and that program officer looks through the existing projects that, let's say, would be supplying small salaries to women in certain villages to provide health care to their neighbors. And the person looks at that and says, well, that looks like a really good project, and that one's great, and that one's great. My recommendation is that we just sustain the projects we have. You'd be fired because you're being brought in to have creative new ideas, to leverage their money. So the narcissistic fantasy of the donor community is that we're going to do small, inexpensive interventions that rely on volunteers that are sustainable because they won't pay anybody a salary and they won't provide any real material benefits. As long as you're wedded to that, you're stuck with training. So if you can get rid of that, if you can pay for real things, fine. The Africa specific, I think in some ways this is very Africa specific in multiple senses. So I actually think NGOs work differently on different cultural soil. So my impression is that Latin America, about which I know remarkably little, but that the long-term Maya cultural influences there have made various kinds of cooperatives work much better than they do anywhere else. And so I think many things that look like fair trade NGOs and so forth, actually many of them work quite well. And they work in somewhat the way donors are imagining, because local cultural context is more similar. There's less of a bridge, or less of a gap to bridge between the way donors are imagining community participation and the way it might actually work on the ground. I think they don't typically work as well in many Asian contexts where more authority is important, and so there's sort of egalitarian participatory, we're all doing this together. And I think that not everywhere in Africa, but because of the reliance on patron-client ties, which are, Susan and I call these relationships of unequal interdependence. And I don't think Westerners can read that very well. I don't think they see it. I don't think they understand it, and they certainly don't understand, except in a very superficial way, the critical roles that local elders, chiefs play in local life. And so they try to work against rather than with the grain of the societies they are trying to intervene in. And Jaren's question was a really big question. So I would say that, good Lord, I guess I don't.
If the end can stay in chat.
Yeah, that would stay in chat.
Well, please give a well applause to Anne, who's done a marvelous job.